Hey, my name is Charlie Brown, and I'm part of the Journey Church that meets in Chesapeake, and I'm sharing this week at the Journey Church this Sunday morning. We're in the middle of a series called Been There and Done That. And so the topic for discussion this week is what I call being more than a conqueror. I'm sure you have been there and done that when you're going through life and everything just seems to collapse and you ask the question, why me? How do I overcome? How do I deal with these kinds of things? So this message addresses that at least to some degree. For much of my life, I have heard people say things like, there's a purpose for everything. And I've always struggled with that phrase, there's a purpose for everything, because I would ask the question, what's the purpose of death? What's the purpose of sex trafficking? What's the purpose of famine or civil war or those kinds of disasters? Did God plan that? Did he have a purpose that he plugged it in? And the answer I came up with was no. I don't think there's a purpose for everything because some things are so destructive, they just don't have a purpose. But crazy, wild stuff does absolutely happen, and we do have a tendency to, we question, why did that happen and why me? When I was a kid, I loved to live in a fantasy world. I probably still enjoy living in a fantasy world. I love to go to the movies on Saturday morning at the Texas Theater, the same one where Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, because Saturday morning was kids' theater time. And we got to go to the movies for a lot cheaper. And so I love to go and watch these super actors in my time, John Wayne, Steve McQueen, Jimmy Stewart. They were always engaged in movies where there was the good guy versus the bad guy. And the good guy was always the underdog. It was like there was John Wayne and there were 1,000 Indians, or there was Steve McQueen and there was the mafia. There was Jimmy Stewart and there was a whole town of people against him. And yet, even though they were the underdog, they would always come out victorious. So I love that fantasy part that says you go in, you're the underdog, but there's the belief that you can overcome, that you can win, and you can come out victorious. I think Paul is kind of addressing that issue. Now, when I look around today and I think, what movies are we watching today? What superheroes? Do you know what I see? Barbie. Come on, Barbie? Really? You got to be kidding me. Anyway, being what the Bible calls being an overcomer is not a fantasy. It's a reality. The ability to live a victorious life and to take on all of the stuff that comes our way. Sometimes it comes our way because of bad decisions we've made. A lot of times stuff just comes at us. It's just in the world. And it's just not good. And it really wrecks our life. It has a tendency to kind of frame who we are. And the response that we have to that really does frame who we are. And it kind of dictates how we're going to live our lives, how we're going to lead our country, and how we're going to lead our churches. So I want to pause quickly and ask you a question. How do you frame your life? How do you deal with the struggles and the challenges of society today? Political issues, educational issues, family issues, financial matters, whatever it is. How do you confront those and how do you grapple with them? Do you tend to be fearful? When those things smack you in the face, do you have a tendency to complain and see yourself as the victim? Look what happened to me, I didn't deserve this. Or do you kind of just take the bull by the horns and say, well, this has happened and this is what I'm going to do? Do you take steps to solve the problem, or do you have a tendency to simply complain about the problem? So pause the video, think about that, and try to be clear with yourself. How do I respond to these things? What's my strategy? Is it a healthy strategy, or am I somewhat self-destructive? Okay? Paul writes to the church in Rome, and he addresses this issue of the fact that bad things happen, and they happen to good people. They happen quite frequently to followers of Christ and to the people in the context of the New Testament church. If you look at the New Testament church, as a matter of fact, they're sort of like those characters that I would go see on Saturday mornings in the movies. They were all underdogs. They were outnumbered. They were out-resourced. The Romans didn't like them. The Jews didn't like them. Greeks didn't like them. Gentiles didn't like them. Nobody liked them. Everybody was against them. And historically, there was a great deal of persecution because they chose to follow Christ. So, but what was the response? How were they supposed to deal with that? Did they say, oh my gosh, look at me, I'm a poor victim because I've made this decision to follow Christ? Or did they engage in this battle and come out on the victorious side? Paul writes a letter to the church in Rome, and he kind of talks to the Christians in Rome about this specific dilemma. In his letter in Romans chapter 8, verses 28 through 31 and 35 and 36, I've tried to shrink it down a bit. This is what he says. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Paul is writing to the church in Rome, and he writes to the church today to say that those who are called by Christ are more than conquerors. Does bad stuff happen? Yes. But we are called to overcome and to be the ones to respond to those challenges and to kind of transform, quote, badness, unquote, into, quote, goodness, unquote. Paul writes in the greater context of Romans chapter 8 about different ways to approach life. He said there are two ways that we tend to do this. The first way, he says, is that people choose to live according to the, quote, flesh, unquote. These are people that say, we're going to live void of God. We're not going to hear his truth. We're not listening to what he says. We're not trying to follow him. We are very independent people, and we believe that we can live and lead lives totally independent of God. We don't need God. That's archaic. It's insignificant. It's irrelevant to us. This is a description of spiritual death. Separation from God is spiritual death. And spiritual death leads us to a very dismal life, void of substance, full of futility. It's very similar to what we call today burnout. So burnout is technically when you use all of your energy, full speed ahead, to achieve a specific goal or to fulfill a purpose, and in spite of the 100% of your energy and resources, you come up short consistently over and over and over. It's what Paul is saying. Living life in the world is using all of your resources, and at the end of the day, you come up short. And so life is full of futility and frustration. It leads to anger and bitterness and blame and, oh my gosh, look at me, poor me. It's similar, this thing called burnout, or even spiritual death if you want to, is similar to a dirt bike racing up a hill. If you've ever seen these videos, these motocross motorcycles, they get a running start and then they go up this incredibly steep hill. It's a hill with a lot of loose gravel and dirt, and the motorcycle is just spinning and it's spraying dirt and sand everywhere. It shoots up the hill and then it gets right to the very top, and you're never sure if they're going to make it or not. Sometimes they do. Burnout is when that motorcycle gets right to the edge, about 2 feet from the finish line, and the engine is still running full power, maximum RPM. The back wheel is spinning as fast as that machine can force it to spin, and so you think we're making progress, but in reality, you're standing still. You come up short of the finish line, and you're just stuck in futility, frustration, and go, oh my gosh, everything failed. That's what Paul is describing as one way to live the world, through your own energy, through your own strength, void of God, his truth, his spirit, etc. There's another way of living, and Paul describes that as simply living quote, by the Spirit of God, unquote. So you're living according to the character of God, the truth of God, the Holy Spirit of God, the teachings of God, the disciplines of God. It's living with His purpose, His intent, and the way He has called us to live. And so when we are doing that, we certainly put forth effort, but our greatest energy and resource comes from God Himself. And He's the one who drives us and pushes us. He's the one that pulls us across the finish line to guarantee that we're going to be able to accomplish the very thing that He wants to accomplish in us and the very things that we want to accomplish for ourselves. This life by the Spirit offers what I call significant meaning and authentic peace. And peace, that's something we would love in this world today because we feel like there's not much of it. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the power to overcome the conflict. It gives us that great power, and that power comes from that relationship with God. So I have another question for you. Have you ever been there and done that? Have you ever had that experience of burnout where you're working so hard to do something so important and significant in life, whether it's a career or a family or financial management or who knows what, and you work as hard as you can, and yet in spite of your maximum effort, you fall short. And you're frustrated, and life is nothing but a big blob of futility for you. Have you ever been there? Would you like to change that? Would you like to live a way that's a bit different? I think Paul wants to address that for you. So take some time, think about that, ponder it a bit, and then come back and let's finish the video. God is well aware of our struggles. He sent His Son into a world that was full of struggle, and He had to deal with those struggles. First century believers were people that were outnumbered, overpowered, unpopular. They were the underdogs. But fear, frustration, and defeat is never the plan of God. It was not the plan for first century believers, and it's not the plan of God for you and for me. So how do you and I respond to what I'm simply calling badness, whether it's in politics, education, family, child rearing, whatever it is? How do we respond to that? Many people in society respond like this. They look upon themselves and they perceive themselves as a victim. They say, it's not fair. They're picking on me. This is unjust. And so their lives are filled with whining and complaining and arguing and blaming. So something bad happens. I feel bad, it's against me, it's unfair, and it's their fault. At no point does this part of society ever stop and say, this is a problem, and it doesn't really matter who created the problem. The question is, who's going to solve the problem? Who's going to move us from that to the thing that God desires for us? Who is willing to do that? I recently read that we now live in a culture called victimhood culture, where people are incentivized to publicize their grievances. If something goes wrong, they go on Facebook, and they want everyone to know, I was at a fast food restaurant and my food was late. My child went to school and they didn't make an A, and so it has to be the teacher's fault, or it's a problem of education. All of these things just come pouring in, and our response is gripe, complain, whine, poor me, poor me. There is no response of who solves it. Paul addressed this in Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, a very powerful verse. Listen to what he says. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. If you kind of turn that around, it sounds like it says, if you're going to grumble and argue and whine and moan and groan and be the victim, you're going to compromise the very purity in your relationship with God. You're going to compromise your ability to be able to overcome and be victorious and solve problems and move the world forward and move your own life forward. Our society is known by griping, whining, and blaming, and everybody's at fault, and no one assumes responsibility to correct anything. If we're followers of Jesus, we are called to be co-laborers with Jesus. We work together with Christ to rework and to redeem and to transform badness into something that is good. That's what Paul was talking about. To go back to verse 28 in Romans 8, it said, God works for the good. He works for the good for those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. The literal meaning of this verse sounds something more like this. God continues to work in cooperation with us for the good. God is the subject of the sentence. God is the one who has all the power and the resources and the ability to work good, but it's the plan and the desire of God to work hand in hand in cooperation with us to accomplish that good. He can't accomplish good through us if all we want to do is whine and blame. And so he needs us to be in that a position with Him in which we are pure. We allow Him to flush all of the toxic junk out of our life and transform us and conform us to be like the image of His Son, in order to be a co-worker with Him to move badness to becoming more like goodness. God's not working all things for the good for everyone. He said God is working all things to the good for those who love Him, those who are called according to His purpose, those who are in the process of being conformed in the image of Christ. Those are the victors. Those are the ones who have the capacity and the ability to transform our world to be a totally different place. So in the event that you're grumbling and arguing and whining, you're contaminating yourself and you're preventing yourself from accomplishing some of the greatest things that God that God desires for you for our lives. One more time of questioning. What is your first response when something goes wrong? Can you identify within yourself, where do you go? Do you stop and think, this happened, how do I fix it? What was the real cause of it? Or do you immediately shift to kind of a default of blaming somebody else or just complaining about a problem rather than attempting to address it? Can you identify your response? And are you willing to say, I want to commit my response to God so that in the future, it doesn't matter what happens, where it came from, who caused it, how bad it is. I want to be part of the solution. I want to be a problem solver. I want to be a victor. I want to be an overcomer. But I need to recognize where and how can God use me, and what does God need to change in me to get to that point. Think about that, and then come back to the video, and we'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes. There are a lot of people in the world who want to work to make the world a better place. There are all kinds of good people who want to do this. They can be first responders, school teachers, churches, nonprofit organizations. They are good people attempting to do good things. The problem is they don't have the power to do what God desires. He makes it so clear that these people who are going to be more than conquerors and the victors are the people who are going to respond to His invitation. When He says, I called you, I need you to love me. I will justify you. I will equip you to do great things. And then you'll be glorified when you cross the finish line. That's a call to perseverance, to say we don't give up and we don't become frustrated. We don't become weak when things don't go well around us. We continue to move forward and to plow ahead. I'll give you one of what probably should be many confessions in my life. I love war movies. I don't love war. I understand the incredible degradation of war, the destruction of war, and that it is an evil thing. And so I don't worship war. I don't like war. But there's something about war movies that I always gravitate towards. Fictional movies, war movies based on true stories, and documentaries. There's a movie series called The Band of Brothers, based on a true story. An awful lot of fact and truth in this movie series. And there is a scene in which the Easy Company is engaged in the Battle of the Bulge. They understand that this is a critical battle, and if they don't hold their position, The German armies can overtake them, and it could prevent them from moving forward and ending the war and winning for the Allies and defeating Nazi Germany. These soldiers became role models, I think, for what other soldiers should be like. They had a sense of calling. They went to war because they saw a mission, that their mission was to defeat Nazi Germany and the powers that wanted to dominate the world. They were fighting for freedom. That was the mission. They understood that there was a serious sacrifice involved in that. They understood that they might lose their lives because of that. But they were willing to engage in the battle. They took it on, and they fought, and they fought, and they never gave up. They fought in a time when it was bitterly cold. They didn't have winter clothing. They were short on ammunition. They were short on food. They were short on medical supplies. They were short on everything. They were the underdogs because they became totally surrounded by the German army, and they were seriously outnumbered by the German army. The American commander came to them and they said, "The German commander has communicated to us that we are totally surrounded, we have absolutely no chance of surviving, and we need to surrender." The response of the American commander back to the German commander was one word: nuts. We're not quitting, and we're not going to surrender. As a matter of fact, when one of the members of Easy Company, who was a paratrooper, heard what was said, when he heard that they were surrounded, he just laughed and said, "We're paratroopers. We're supposed to be surrounded. What did you expect? This is our calling. This is who we are." I think Paul says to you and to me in this letter to the church at Rome, we are the ones who are called by God to change the world. He will do the changing, but by design, He wants to work hand in hand with us. We are His co-laborers. He's going to work good in the midst of bad with us and through us. He can do it by Himself, but that's not His plan. His plan is to do it with us and through us. And that's why He created the church. The church is the body of Christ, the called out ones, the ones who have been justified. Their sins are forgiven, and they are empowered by the Spirit of God to do whatever He calls them to do. We have been, we will be glorified. In other words, when we cross the finish line, that will be a great time of celebration for us. That will be a time of glory. Let me remind you what Paul said. This one sentence says it all. In all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. You and I live in a warped, crooked world, a difficult society filled with all kinds of evil and struggles and just badness. But the church is the only one that is called and equipped to respond to this issue, the only one who can go in and say, we can change the world, we have a solution to these problems, but we will not be that solution if we are not in the process of allowing ourselves to be conformed to the image of Christ, if we're not following Christ in obedience, if we don't answer that call. We cannot afford to simply whine and moan and groan and blame the world about why the church isn't growing and why things aren't going well. So the challenge, it's not my challenge to you, it's God's challenge to you, is are you willing to accept His calling? Are you willing to follow Him, to be justified by Him, and to join Him in the incredible and amazing work that He's doing? Do you love Him? Or are you willing to love Him to that degree? I hope you have a good week, and I hope this message helps to equip you to deal with the serious issues of life. Thanks for listening.
There's a table that you prepared for me in the presence of my enemies. It's your body and your blood you shed for me. This is how I fight my battles. There's a table that you prepared for me is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how.
In the valley, I know that you're with me, and surely your goodness and mercy follow me. So my weapons are praise and thanksgiving. This is how I fight my battles. Amen. And I believe you've overcome, and I will lift my song of praise for all you've done. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how. Oh Jesus, we're calling on your name, Lord. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you, God. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. Sing this out. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you, God. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you, God. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you, God. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by